Uh, Hello, everyone. Welcome to our commencement lecture for the spring-summer semester at Fabrica. This new semester starts with a very special guest. As has become a tradition, we are inviting a personality, a friend that we believe represents best the ideas or questions that we are going to ask. Our commencement lecture for the spring-summer semester at Fabrica. This new semester starts with a very special guest. As has become a tradition, we are inviting a personality, a friend that we believe represents best the ideas or questions that we are going to ask. Our commencement lecture for the spring-summer semester at Fabrica. This new semester starts with a very special guest. As has become a tradition, we are inviting a personality, a friend that we believe represents best. Okay, we're having some technical online questions, but I'm going to continue. This semester we have decided to define a theme we have called Archaism, a wider concept and topic that is just an excuse to ask ourselves questions that deal with notions of ancestral knowledge, creating an equal exchange system with our environment and the non-human, but also that is critical with the material culture that surrounds us, questioning technology and its position, and dealing with ancient cosmologies of traditional cultures with a non-Western and non-aligned thinking, with a belief that inherited intuition and learning by making can be an antidote to the technocratic excess and capitalistic inertia, and with a firm belief that creative strategies in synergy with natural system and new ecological attitudes offer an alternative to the stagnation of our times. This is the reason we invited our guests today to launch our program and to inspire us through these challenging times. No other contemporary thinker has dealt or answered those questions better than him. I'm very happy and honored to introduce Tim Ingold. Ingold's work embraces a human that feels and senses the world as an organism in synergic motion with the environment, co-creating ecologies with other species and material processes, propelling us away from the influence of neo-Darwinian biology and the rigid structures of cognitive sciences. His thought presents a fertile ground where a creator, designer, artist can grow and become a better self in perfect harmony with the environment and with our neighboring species. His interest within the disciplines of anthropology, archaeology, art, and architecture range from environmental perception, language, technology, and skill practice, creativity, theories of evolution, human-animal relations, and a new human ecological approaches in anthropology. Emeritus Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Aberdeen, Fellow of the British Academy and the Royal Society of Edinburgh, Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Manchester for over 25 years, and later Director and Founder of the Department of Anthropology in Aberdeen from 1999 to 2019. Specialist on the peoples of the North, developed long fieldwork research among the Sami and the Finnish people of the Lapland. Director of the project Knowing from the Inside, Anthropology, Art, Architecture and Design from 2013 to 2018. He has written a myriad of books and articles from which I will name just a few. The Perception of the Environment, essays on livelihood, dwelling and skill. The Life of Lines, Ways of Walking, Ethnography and Practice on Food. Being Alive, essays on movement, knowledge and description. Anthropology, Why It Matters. Imagining for Real, essays on creation, attention and correspondence. And a new book he just finished writing and that we are eager to read, from where his lecture today is taken from. So we are really happy to have Timothy Ingold with us today. Let's all welcome him, and thanks for accepting our invitations. Thank you very much. Are eager to read, from where his lecture today is.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be joining with you. And I want to begin by talking about generations.
And thanks for accepting our invitation.
We're used to thinking of generations as layers that stack up one over another. So we imagine that with every new generation, a new layer is added on top, and previous ones sink further into the past. Excuse me, but there is a problem with the technical things, because I keep hearing an echo that's coming back, and it's quite difficult to speak against it. Can it be resolved?
Yes, I think that there was an interference with the YouTube, so I think that we solved that problem.
Because my words were still coming back at me. Okay, I'll start again. I'm sorry about that. We're rather used to thinking of generations as layers that stack up one over another, so that with every new layer added on top, previous ones sink further into the past. This way of thinking infects all sorts of areas. For example, where we often think about layers of sedimentation in the history of the Earth, or layers of deposit in the occupation of an archaeological site, or layers of documents in an archive. We even talk about layers of consciousness in the human mind. Everything seems to be layered. And this is a way of thinking that has worked itself into our thinking, often without our noticing it, into every sphere in which human pasts and futures are at stake, in concerns about tradition and heritage, about conservation and extinction, about sustainability and progress, and about art and science. Now, I wonder, what if we were to imagine generations differently, not as layers in a stack, but as strands in a rope? And I'm just going to share my screen quickly so that then you can see what I mean. So there on the right, you see a set of layers sort of arrayed vertically, one layer on top of the other on top of the other. So there are 5 generations. Here's the one at the top, the next, and the earliest one here. Here I've drawn 5 generations, not as a stack, but as a kind of rope in which each generation is a strand, and they run parallel with one another and overlap. So what if we were to imagine generations not as layers in a stack, but as the strands of a rope, and imagine every life as a strand? Of course, a life can be only so long, but as old ones give out, new ones are continually paid in, so the rope can go on winding indefinitely. And here it is in the overlap of individual lives, in their collaboration, that life as a whole is carried on and regenerated. So my subject for today is, how might rethinking generations along these lines affect the way we also think about the past, the future, and about the work of remembering? Now, in this diagram here, I've put the rope on the side, so to speak. It's the same diagram, but running horizontally rather than vertically. And so here are 4 generations, and they're connected by relations of what I call begetting. So this life here, this generation, begat this generation number 2, which in turn begat this generation number 3, which then begat this generation number 4. And as you see, there's an overlap. So 1 overlaps with 2, maybe even just with 3, and so on. And when we recite genealogical narratives, they typically take the form of a series of this kind. So take, for example, a classic narrative in the book of Genesis, which says, this is the generations of Adam, it says. And it tells how Adam begat Seth, who begat Enos, who begat Canaan, who begat Mahalalel, who begat Enoch, who begat Methuselah, who begat Lamech, who begat Noah. So you have this long line of people, each of which is begetting the next, like this. But now imagine that you yourself are in this picture. You are one of the strands. As you go through life, or as you age, it's as though this entire series spools forward, that is in the direction towards the left. So the process of spooling forward, so you're starting here and you're ending there, and as you start here, you end there, then at some point in your life you have a child who starts here and ends there, and so on. As this process is going on in a direction contrary to the genealogical narrative. It's a bit as though you are standing in a queue. Imagine you're standing in a queue and the whole queue is gradually shuffling forward. You're waiting, you're queuing for an ice cream, and there's the ice cream van up ahead, and there are all these people standing in front of you and other people standing behind. And the queue is continually shuffling forward as the rope continues to wind. You are following the people in front of you, who are following the people in front of them, and so on. And behind you come the people after you. So you can see that the process of aging is the opposite of the process of begetting. So now, imagine you're standing in this queue. They're the people in front of you, they're the people behind you. Your predecessors are ahead. They're the people who will get to the ice cream before you do. Your successors are behind. Now, in real life, of course, not all predecessors are still alive, and not all your successors are yet born. But still, your predecessors, your ancestors, still have a hold over you. That is, you are beholden to them, as you in turn still have a hold over your successors. So your ancestors who are before you or in front of you beckon you to come on, even as you await the coming of your descendants who are behind you. And so you process through life, measuring out your days towards the future, which, rather like a spatial horizon, recedes as fast as you approach it. So that is what we see here in the top row. So here am I, and this little thing, this is my nose, so I'm looking from above. So you see, I'm going in this direction, then ahead of me are my ancestors, behind me are my descendants. And you see, the ancestors are in the future because they are already where I'm going to be sometime later on. My descendants are in the past because they're still treading in the footsteps that I left some time ago. So we have a movement from past into the future. But now, suppose that you are suddenly commanded, here you are suddenly commanded to turn around by 180 degrees. So you were facing this way, but now you're going to turn round like that, face the other way. So suppose you're standing in the queue, and you're all facing towards where it is you're trying to go, to the ice cream van, but you suddenly turn round, and then as soon as you do so, the people who were in front of you are at your back, whilst you find that you are face to face with the people who were behind you. So everything changes. The people who went before are now, these people are now at your back, while you are face to face with those following after. So the future, which once had stretched out into the distance along ancestral paths, now appears to be heading on a collision course straight towards you, while the ancestors recede ever further into the past. And this act of turning stakes a claim for the present. So again, thinking of the queue, the present is like a hold-up, an attempt to arrest the passage of time, to bring time to a standstill. It's like you stand facing all the people who are coming after you and say, stop, don't go any further. But of course, no generation can hold its stand indefinitely. Eventually, it will get pushed aside to make way for the next. So we end up with a picture of history as a punctuated series of generational turning points. Now, the proper meaning of tradition, the word it comes from the Latin tradere, meaning a handover, perhaps as in a relay race, where one person hands on the baton to the next. The proper meaning of tradition is not to live in the past, but to follow your predecessors into the future. So in this top row here, you are following a tradition because you're following the people who've gone before you into the future. So the pastness of tradition is not something that is given a priori, but is produced in the very act of turning that stakes a claim to the present. So it's when you do this turn here that what had been a movement to the future is relegated to the past. And at the same time, this turn creates a future that, from the perspective of those still following traditional ways, is nothing if not backward looking, sacrificing the possibility of ceaseless beginning for the finality of predetermined ends. And such, I think, is the way of modernity. It's a way that measures time by the clock. You could ask a simple question: why does the clock tick? There's a revolving movement of the clock driven by the vital force of the unwinding spring, but it's a movement that is periodically stopped on the cog of an escapement wheel by a ratchet, only to be released again. So the tick, when you hear the clock tick, the tick is the sound of the ratchet's engagement with the cog. And the measured time of the clock is not the unwinding of the spring, but a series of stoppages. So thus do generations mark time by converting its onward movement to a punctuated series of escapements. So the flow becomes a stutter. And when life escapes, the whole series shifts one notch, like this. So the foregoing generation, far from moving into the future, vanishes into the oblivion of the past, while the generation to come pivots to take its place in the present. So every generation, having turned its back on the past, positions itself as a gatekeeper to the future. So whereas the spring is unwinding this way along the dimension of lived time, clock time gives us a series of escapements that work in the reverse direction, but accumulate along another axis. And I think that's why there is such a compulsion to replace the old with the new. It proves, for modern people, that time is passing and history is being made. Indeed, nothing catches the modern imagination more than the idea of a step change. Because in the eyes of the present, the future figures less as a path to be followed than as a problem to be solved. But the present's ownership of the future depends on the assumption that the past got it wrong. This is the default assumption of the modern age, that the road from the past is paved with errors. Every generation, then, is fated to live among the ruins of the now obsolete futures proposed by generations past, perhaps only half constructed before being demolished to make way for the next. So what then is passed on from one generation to the next? Not a tradition, certainly, but a heritage. And to convert tradition into heritage, it must have been somehow broken off from the ebbs and flows of life and from the histories of place and people, of which our own life histories are the continuation. Only then can it be handed over, fully formed and intact, as an object of memory. I can do. Sorry, I'm just going to I want to stop sharing, but there's another thing that gets right. So consider a familiar path. You've walked it many times with your parents and grandparents, who may have walked it with theirs when they were young. The path is something that you and they make together. But precisely because it's continually produced in the collaboration of generations, the path is not inherited. In everyday experience, to walk a path is to remember how it goes. It's a vital movement of prolongation that anticipates the future, even as it trails a storied past. So to convert the path into heritage, you would have to break that movement. So walking a heritage trail is not to carry on a living tradition, but to reenact a past that is already over, already complete. So you see, on the heritage trail, we can never walk in the footsteps of our ancestors, since the logic of inheritance places us on separate layers whose surfaces can touch like the pages of a stack, but whose lines can never meet. It's like thinking of every walk as a kind of rollout, which, far from inscribing existing ground, leaves that ground untouched, while layering a new one to be marked up with its own inscriptions. So with every walk, you add a new layer. And yet, except under artificial conditions, which protect the heritage path from the wear of passing feet, for example, by placing it under glass, this isn't what happens in practice. So far from adding a new layer, the walker's footprints contribute to its ongoing inscription. Meanwhile, the ground surface itself is continually renewed, not by adding new layers, but by removing them by way of natural processes of erosion that are continually wearing the ground away. Well, if we were to imagine, place ourselves in a landscape and look around, and we'd see a ground crisscrossed with paths and tracks and maybe other walls and boundaries of one sort and another. Some of these look very old and may be quite hard to see. Perhaps they can only be visible from the air. But more recent tracks show up very much more clearly. And you might ask, why is this? Why is it that old paths are so hard to discern and new ones show up so clearly, so obviously? Well, if we were to imagine the landscape as made up of a series of layers, we would then have to suppose that each layer is semi-translucent, allowing us, as it were, to see through the top layers to the earlier layers below. Because each layer is semi-opaque, because they're not perfectly transparent, the earlier they are, the harder they are to see. So you might imagine that thinking of the landscape as a series of layers, and you think, well, I can only just see those very old paths because they are so deep down, and I'm having to look through so many other layers before I can see them, that I can only just make them out. But what happens, in fact, is precisely the opposite. That is, old ways, old paths in the landscape are rather faint and hard to see because weathering has brought them almost to the surface, very soon to disappear. Whereas later paths have left much deeper marks in the landscape, and the most recent, of course, the deepest of all. Now, it's rather the same as what happens in the formation of what is called the palimpsest. The palimpsest is the name that is given to by medieval people who study medieval writing. When people wrote with ink on parchment. Parchment was very expensive, so people would reuse it if they could. And so to reuse a parchment, which had already been written upon, you had to take a knife and scrape the surface until as much as possible of the old writing had been stripped away, and then you could write on it again. But it's impossible to strip away the old writing completely, and so you get the appearance when you write again, you can still see the vestiges of the old writing still there. But the interesting thing is that with the palimpsest, between every round of inscription, the surface is actually scraped rather than overlaid. So with the palimpsest, old inscriptions, the older ones, don't lie beneath the semi-translucent surface of the present, but rather rise up to the surface, even as newer writing sinks down. So it's the opposite of a stratigraphic picture. It's the opposite of adding one layer upon another. With the palimpsest, the past old inscriptions are continually rising to the surface as new ones sink down. So there's a kind of turnover, overturning rather than layering. Now, if we imagine, I'm just going to share my screen again and get back to where I was. And go to, yeah. Now, if the ground stacks up, or if we imagine the ground to stack up in layers, then memory effectively works as an archive. That is, we imagine memories forming a deposit in which older memories are stacked beneath later ones, which are deposited above. And so the past in a stack, the past can only be accessed by the extraction of lower layers and their conversion into heritage. So memorializing the past is undoing the work of time. So if you've got a stack like I have here, then you have to go under to discover the past from these lower layers. And then in that view, with that layered view, the future can only be projected. And so memorialization and projection face in opposite directions. But again, we could ask, what if the ground does not stack, but turns? Now, in the cycle of turning, under means coming up, over means going down. So what is over is no longer above on the virtual plane of the future, but is already on its way down into the past. We say that's over now, that's finished, that's done. It's going down. And what is under is no longer beneath in the past, but is arising to the surface of ongoing activity as it heads into the future. So this is not underneath, but underway. So with a turning ground, over is going down and under is coming up. But with a stacked ground, under is deep down there and over is up here. Now consider the case of burial, when we bury people. Now, according to Giambattista Vico in his New Science, the very term human comes from the Latin humando, referring to the funerary rites of burial. So for him, both by origin and destiny, humans are of the soil, that is humus. Well, it's likely that this etymology is fanciful, but nevertheless, we can say that there's a thing about humans is that they do bury their dead. And in a sense, burial turns the page on a life, but it's not the end of the story, which it's the task of coming generations to carry on. So remembering, in the case of burial, remembering does not undo, but joins with the work of time, that is, of weather and the passage of the seasons, in bringing ancient ways to the surface so that they can be followed by the living as they fare into the future. And this bringing up is what I call unearthing. So burial is linked to unearthing. It's rather like when you bury a tuber or a root in the ground, hoping that it will then sprout forth and bring forth crops. You bury in order that things will rise up. And this unearthing is the opposite of excavation. To excavate is to empty a deposited past of its contents, to hollow it out. That's what archaeologists do in excavating the levels of occupation of a site. And for them, mostly, the earth figures as an archive, holding in the soil a record of past generations in its sediments, in its layers. So if you're an archaeologist, the grave, the place of burial, is a place of deposition rather than burial. The body is simply deposited there. And with deposition, every layer sinks deeper and deeper below the surface. So it follows that deposition is the very opposite of burial. And where deposition affords excavation, burial is a condition for unearthing, for establishing a foundation for ongoing life. As, for example, I mentioned when burying roots or tubers in the ground holds the promise of vegetative growth. So that means that turning the ground is the opposite of archiving. To adopt a word from the philosopher Erin Manning, the ground becomes an anarchive, where the archive is inert and passive, it's just the stuff is just deposited. The anarchive is active, it's continually wanting to bubble up. So landscape as an archive is a riot of subterranean roots and runners, ever issuing above ground into new life. Now, I've argued that to journey along a way of life is to remember those who have gone before, and that's what it means to observe a tradition. To use another word, it is a process of longing. We long for those who've gone before us and whom we will never reach. But longing, as it rebounds on the one who longs, is also a process of belonging. So how this longing, belonging, we heard earlier of the case of holding and beholding. The ancestors have a hold on you, you are beholden to them. It's a bit the same here. We long for the ancestors, but because of our longing for the ancestors, we also belong. And so too, people of the coming generation, in following their elders, become the persons they are. So there can be no becoming without coming, or no belonging without longing. So coming and longing, or journeying and remembering, it's the same thing, are two aspects of the same fundamental movement. And critically, therefore, they face not in contrary directions, respectively towards the future and towards the past, but in the same direction. So the ancestors we follow are always ahead. We can grasp them neither physically nor in the categories of thought. We will never reach them, let alone overtake. But that is why we long for them. Now, for us modern, accustomed as we are to submerging the past beneath the present and erecting the future over it, this may seem an odd conclusion to reach. It is very hard for us to divest ourselves of the assumption that memory is retrospective. How can you possibly project into the future, we say, and cast into the past at one and the same time? Wouldn't you have to be literally Janus-faced, looking both front and back simultaneously. But longing doesn't go from a point of departure to a point of destination. It follows a different axis, seeking not to conjure up the future or to wish back the past, but to align care and attention with the temporal stretch of life. So longing is neither utopian nor nostalgic. It affords no final release into the light, as in utopian dreams of a perfect world, nor does it hanker after a past irretrievably overwritten by the present. Rather, longing feels its way into a kind of twilight zone with no end in sight. And that is the zone that we're in, but at least it offers a way forward into the future. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much. I just have to.
Thank you very much, Tim. It was fantastic to hear you and really looking forward to read the book. And I'm gonna try to see if there is some questions here in the auditorium. And then if not, I'm gonna ask you a few questions. Is there any questions?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you well.
My name is Luca. Thank you for a lecture. Mr. Ingold was wonderful. About the turning point, looking at tradition as a way to turn to the future. It made me remember of an indigenous philosopher in Brazil called his name escapes me now, but
Never mind. Doesn't matter.
Thank you. Yes, Ailton Krenak, and he says that traditions are the only way to go to the future in a sustainable way. I would like to know if you think that by the ways we're going recently with technology and AI and media and the way we're going, if there's any way that we can bring back that respect for traditions in a way that is democratic and that everyone can have access to.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. I mean, I agree with him that tradition is the way into the future. And I've, in writing this book that I've drawn on, most of my examples, I didn't mention them here because it would take too long, but I've been drawing on indigenous philosophies to establish the point that tradition doesn't mean being stuck in the past. It doesn't mean living a backward life. It means the promise of the future. And this is a line we should take. And it seems to me that this whole clamor for artificial intelligence, for a digital world linked to progress towards some ultimate dream of transhuman life is going in completely the wrong direction. and so what I'm arguing for is that we somehow managed to turn around again. I mean, the trouble is that we've made this 180-degree turn and turned our back on tradition. We have to turn around again and face forward. I think we need to do that, but the one thing that is preventing us from doing that is the continual equation of tradition with heritage. Because heritage, the discourse of heritage, does put tradition into a past that is over and that is simply there to be conserved, not to guide us into the future. So we somehow have to recognize that tradition is about the future, not just about the past, and therefore that it is not that honoring tradition is not about the conservation of heritage. But how we get this message through is, I wish I knew. I just don't know how we do it.
Well, if while we were hearing you, it came to my mind the theory and the philosophy of a Russian cosmist called Nicholas Fedorov. I don't know if you ever heard of him, but for answering this question, he said that the only way would be to resuscitate all our ancestors, and he proposed in his book, The Common Task, probably the ambitious idea of being able to resuscitate everyone that has come before us, no? Which is probably one of the most radical ideas I've ever heard. But I really wanted to hear what you think about that, and also if you ever heard of that theory.
To be honest, I haven't. And it does sound a bit crazy. I mean, I don't think we have to bring these characters literally back to life, because I mean, the way I think about it is this: that again, drawing on indigenous cosmologies, the Chukchi people, for example, whom I've been reading about, they're from northeastern Siberia, say that when you die, I mean, so long as the right rituals are observed, you re-enter life. That when somebody is alive, that being alive is something like being an eddy in a stream. That the stream's flowing along and it turns on itself, and it creates a being, and that being can go on for a certain length of time until eventually its energy runs out, and then it flows back. And it flows back into life. So it's a movement from the actual to the possible, if you will. And it's out of that possibility that living beings are continually emerging. So I don't think we have to repopulate the world with all our ancestors sort of suddenly brought back to life. But I think that rests on a misconception of what life is. But if we think of life as the realm of the possible, and of living beings as actual, that are brought out from this realm, then people can die, they can pass back into the realm of possibility, out of which new people can then emerge. We don't have to repopulate the world with living versions of all our ancestors.
Thank you very much, Tim. I think that there's some other questions here.
Thank you a lot for the lecture. On one point, it reminded me a bit like of what Isabel Stengers wrote about living on ruins,
Yeah.
and this kind of simultaneous relationship towards the present and the past, and how our society is tempted to be driven on one hand by, like as Lucas just mentioned it, by technophilists, transhumanists, and people that think that future might be healed by an kind of futuristic phantasm. On the other hand, these people also are somehow scared of the past and are somehow telling that people willing to reiterate and heal with their memories are somehow passist. So my question was, how do you think we as a society we could convince each other that like live in peace, and also that's the reality somehow in between? I mean, because in a sense it all depends on the point of view, and how can we be sure that technophilists and the people believing really in transhumanism can step back and also reconsider their relationship towards the past and their ancestors? Thank you.
Well, I agree with Stengers and also many other thinkers that we are effectively living in a perpetual ruin, and I think that follows logically from the stuttering mechanism that I was talking about. That what modernity sees as progress, if you face the other way, simply looks like an accumulating pile of ruins, each of which is superimposed upon the others, and there's no release from that. To my mind, maybe this is what you're getting at. The really difficult question, which I feel still unable to answer satisfactorily, is, well, what happens if your ancestors, who you want to follow, who laid down the tradition, are really bad people, have done terrible things, have supported fascist regimes, and generally you think you really don't want them to be an example. And it's all very well for us to draw our, as I do myself, to draw our examples from indigenous peoples, and on the whole, indigenous people venerate their ancestors and consider them to have been exemplary, to have lived exemplary lives, which one then wants to follow. But we know very well in the societies that we're familiar with from history that this is far from the case. And I really don't quite know how to deal with this issue, nor does anybody else, really. I think that somehow there's a difference between, we can somehow separate out the elements of structural power and domination and exploitation from the more personal kinds of relations of human to human. But I don't know, I really don't know how to do it. And that's the weak point in my argument. Or perhaps you could argue that these ancestors are really only really bad because of the fact that we are living in these structures of ruination, of perpetual ruination. And if we got ourselves the right way round, so to speak, then our ancestors would turn out not to be so bad after all. But I really don't know the answer to that one.
Thank you, Tim. If there is no questions, I think there's Jay.
Hey, thank you for joining us today. One of the things that I think a lot about where I'm from is the American South and how they've reconciled, or rather haven't reconciled, with the past in comparison to something like Germany today. And I think of like physical objects a lot, and what they do to people and how they can numb people to the past, or how they can even make people stop in their tracks. And this example of a clock as ticking and pausing is kind of resonating with me right now. But I suppose I'm curious what your thoughts are on using ways of remembering that can be built kind of into the environment as points of pausing, or the ability to, like in Germany, the Stoppelseine, seeing a physical reminder that this is where somebody was physically taken or killed, versus a Confederate statue, which is in some ways numbing people and also erasing the past and venerating the past. But this weak point in your argument that you were just talking about, it just reminds me of how pervasive it is, like in the far right community today, this turn back to the past to bring forward a new future. And it's a very powerful thing. But it seems like if you go a little further back, you could have like good examples of where the past could be helpful. But I don't know, are there examples of cultures that have used physical reminders as ways to prevent things from happening in the future?
I don't know what you were talking about earlier about the far right. I mean, my argument makes sense of that, because what I am saying is that is that way of thinking leads us to memorialize the past. So you put up your statues and so on, and then to see the future as pointing in completely the opposite direction. So then the memorial can provide a kind of rationale, a flag, a symbol, but it's part of it's treated as part of the heritage, and so the problem lies precisely in turning the past travelled into a heritage memorialized, and then immediately the way into the future is pointing the other way from the original path that you travelled. There is the issue that, again, which I didn't touch on, but you know how after a certain period of time has elapsed, it seems as though we can talk about the past, memorialize the past, even romanticize the past. We're thinking it's so long ago that even though absolutely atrocious things happened, we can laugh and joke about them and say, never mind, that was then. Whereas that's not something we can do of things that are within a sort of ancestral memory. It seems as though there's somehow some kind of cutoff point at which burial turns to excavation, and so that, for example, it's not all right to up until that cutoff point, it's not all right to disinter people from their graves, but beyond that cutoff point, it's perfectly all right for archaeologists to get to work and see what they can turn up. So there's some sort of division, and of course a lot of the problems with the ways in which past generations have treated the burials of indigenous peoples come down to this particular issue, in that archaeologists have gone out to the colonies and dug up people's ancestors, robbing them then not just of their past, but of their future as well. So I don't think that really answers the question, but there's a sort of grey area always as to where we define that boundary between where sort of burial ends and excavation begins.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna pass now to ask you a question that we've received from our online community. And here is Eleonora, from an anthropology student in Ca' Foscari in Venice. And she asked how the theory you just put out can be related to the ethnographic work that you've developed. When we talk about tradition, and what are we really looking for?
Well, the most part, what I talked about has come out of my head rather than from any kind of ethnographic work. But I do think my own work has been focused mainly on the indigenous peoples of the circumpolar north, and they talk a lot about the way in which their landscapes are imbued by the presence of ancestors. So I worked with the Sami, for example, and when you travel through a Sami landscape, it's a landscape in which every rock formation, every tree, every hill carries the echoes of presence, carries a kind of, it's haunted by the presence of people who've gone before. And those people who've gone before are still in front of you, and they're still leading the way. That's a very powerful feeling that you get there, and it's the same with, I would venture it's pretty much the same with other indigenous people around the circumpolar north, and indeed in other regions of the world. And over again, you see, indigenous people are trying to tell us that, yes, we do follow our ancestors. Yes, traditions are important. But that doesn't mean that we're living in the past. It means that we're following those ways of our ancestors into the future. I mean, another source that I've drawn on is, of course, the ideas of Aboriginal people in Australia, where they say, right, that the ancestors in the dreaming the time of the dreaming, they laid down what they call the law, and the law is what people follow. So people are following the ancestors, but that doesn't mean that the ancestors lived in some time back then, long ago. But the time they're inhabiting is a kind of every when, and people themselves are inside this order created by the ancestors. They're not coming after it. So, so that's where I'm kind of drawing on these kinds of indigenous cosmologies to try and insist on the point that there's nothing, that traditions are not about the past, they're about the future. Maybe I could give just one other example because it's fresh in my mind. I was reading recently about the island of Fiji in the South Pacific, which is suffering from rising sea levels, and they've had to move quite a few villages on the coastland further inland, otherwise they'd be flooded. And the biggest problem they face in relocating these villages is what to do about the ancestors who are buried there. Because if they leave them there, they'll just get washed out to sea. And the alternative is then to dig them up and move them inland, and that itself is a pretty traumatic thing to do. And the point is that they need to have their ancestors there, not because they're just being nostalgic about it, or because somehow there's something about these ancestors they just can't sort of get free of them, but because the ancestors are actually their future. And if they lose the ancestors, they lose their future. They lose the promise of the future.
Thank you very much, Tim. If there is no other questions, I have some other questions that we received. One of them is related to how much the creative practices have informed your life. I know that you deal a lot with art and architecture, but I wanted to hear from you how much of that has shaped, in a way, your thinking, no, along the years.
Oh, I don't know. I don't think you can distinguish between practices that are creative and practices that are not. But I think that creation is something that is going on all the time. It doesn't belong to me or anybody else, but it's when you make something, you're entering into a creative process, but that process is part of the unfolding of the whole world that you're in. So this so-called creativity, it's not really something you do, it's something you undergo. It happens to you, it pulls you along. And I don't know, I mean, I have my doubts about, I don't like the word creativity. I think creative or creation is all right. I think something went wrong when creation became creativity, in rather the same way as something goes wrong when production becomes productivity. Production is fine, we produce stuff, we bring them forth, but as soon as it becomes productivity, it turns into it's taken over by the calculus of advanced capitalism. And I think the same thing has happened with creativity. It becomes a production of novelty for its own sake or for the sake of the market. And I don't want to have anything to do with that. So I don't know. I don't think that there's anything more creative really about the arts and architecture or music, which I've been more involved in too, than anything else. I don't like the designation of people in these fields as being creatives, as though somehow they have more of some creativity than other people do. I think of creation as something that's continually going on in the world, and the most we can do is to catch the tide of it, so to speak, to enter into it and to get a feel of it from the inside. And I think that's what artists are really doing. They're not really creating, they're tapping into the creation of the world.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Tim. And I think that maybe for closing up, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your new book and when is it coming out?
Well, this is a book called, it's a very short book, about it's about 40,000 words, and it's called the Rise and Fall of Generation Now, and it will be published by Polity Press probably in December. So I only just finished it at the end of January, so there's a lot of production still to do. Because by generation now, I don't mean a particular generation like baby boomers or Generation Z or anything like that. I mean the idea that every generation has captured for itself a slice of the present, as against those who went before it and those that come after it. And so it's a critique of that idea, and I'm trying to show how that way of thinking about generations has layered, as attached to a slice of the present, affects the way we think about all sorts of things, including heritage, conservation, extinction, progress, sustainability, education, science and technology. So that's it.
Thank you again very much, Tim, and I want to thank everybody that joined us today online and also here in the auditorium at Fabrica. And also I just wanted to give a short reminder that you can follow us online and through our social medias to be updated a bit on the events, and also subscribing to our newsletter if you want to follow up. Just a little reminder for those of you, next week we will have a workshop and lecture with Enrico Malatesta and Attila Faravelli, so you can tune in if you want to see or hear the lecture on Wednesday. Thank you again, and see you soon.
Okay, thank you. Goodbye.